George Harrison, the quiet Beatle, was known for his calm demeanor, spiritual pursuits, and devotion to music. Yet beneath that composed exterior simmered a quiet bitterness that grew with time. Harrison rarely raised his voice or lashed out in interviews, but within the Beatles he carried a deep frustration that became increasingly difficult to ignore. It wasn't loud or public, but it was real and personal. As he navigated the overwhelming presence of John Lennon and Paul McCartney, George, often the overlooked member, struggled with feelings of being sidelined, overshadowed, and underestimated. What began as admiration for his more dominant bandmates slowly transformed into resentment, a quiet grudge that never fully healed. His creative contributions often went unacknowledged, leaving him to wrestle with a quiet pain that would resonate long after the Beatles disbanded. Early life and meeting Paul McCartney. In the early 1960s, a young George Harrison was a teenage guitar player on a school bus in Liverpool when he met Paul McCartney. They shared musical interests, traded records, and bonded over their love for skiffle and rock and roll. McCartney, older and more confident, immediately impressed Harrison, and their musical relationship deepened quickly. When George joined John Lennon's band, the Quarrymen, at just 15 years old, he was the youngest member. Lennon initially doubted George's abilities due to his age, but Paul arranged a second audition where George showcased his talent, impressing John. This pivotal moment opened the door to the Beatles' formation, though from the start, George was walking into a narrative already largely defined by Lennon and McCartney. They dominated the band's early identity, and George, despite his talent, was often relegated to the background. The turning point: White Album sessions. By 1968, George Harrison was no longer content to be a passive participant in the Beatles' creative process. He had grown both as a songwriter and as a person, and his frustrations began to boil over. The White Album session saw George's growing dissatisfaction come to a head. Paul McCartney, increasingly controlling, had taken on a de facto leadership role, leaving John Lennon distracted by his relationship with Yoko Ono. In this tense environment, George began to assert himself more forcefully. One of the most infamous moments during the Let It Be sessions occurred when Paul tried to direct George's guitar part for the song Two of Us. Frustrated, George calmly responded, "I'll play whatever you want me to play, or I won't play at all if that's what you want." This quiet but cutting remark was the culmination of years of feeling stifled and creatively suffocated. The tension in the studio had reached a boiling point. The Beatles' breakup and George's emotional struggle. When the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970, the breakup wasn't just a professional split for George Harrison. It was deeply personal. The media focused largely on the tensions between Paul McCartney and John Lennon, but for George, it was about cutting ties with both of them emotionally. George had quietly struggled with resentment for years, especially toward Paul, who he felt had stifled his creativity. While the world saw polite interviews and staged reunions, George was privately navigating the emotional wreckage of a partnership that had once been a source of joy. In 1971, George released All Things Must Pass, a solo album that was both a creative and commercial triumph. The album included songs that had been rejected by the Beatles, showcasing his incredible songwriting talent. One track, Wah Wah, was widely interpreted as a pointed commentary on the emotional noise and frustration George felt during his years in the band, particularly directed at Paul McCartney. Harrison's post-Beatles frustration with McCartney, even after the Beatles' breakup, the bitterness between George and Paul continued to simmer. In 1973, George released Sue Me, Sue You Blues, a song that addressed the legal battles following the band's dissolution. While the song critiqued the entire band, it was clear that much of George's frustration was aimed at Paul, who had initiated the lawsuit to dissolve the Beatles' business partnership. This legal move, while necessary, felt like a betrayal to George, cementing the distance that had grown between them. George's ex-wife, Patty Boyd, later recalled how George would often come home from recording sessions filled with anger, especially after encounters with Paul. "They tolerated each other," Boyd said, "but I don't think they really loved each other." Professionally, George and Paul made a few brief attempts to collaborate after the breakup, but old wounds continued to fester. George and John Lennon's estrangement. While George Harrison's issues with Paul McCartney were more apparent, his relationship with John Lennon was arguably more complex and painful. In the early years of the Beatles, George idolized John. He saw Lennon not only as a bandmate, but also as a mentor. However, as Lennon grew more absorbed in his personal life and his relationship with Yoko Ono, he became emotionally distant from George. John, who had once been close to George, began to mock his spiritual interests, which further alienated Harrison. George turned to meditation and Hindu philosophy as a way to find peace, but Lennon's sarcastic remarks hurt him deeply. This growing estrangement became particularly apparent in George's 1980 memoir, I, Me, Mine, where he barely mentioned John, a silence that spoke volumes about their fractured relationship. Although George expressed sadness when Lennon was murdered in 1980, their complicated history overshadowed any sense of nostalgia. The Beatles anthology and continuing tensions. By the time the surviving Beatles reunited for the anthology project in 1994, George had largely moved beyond the shadow of the band. However, when the three of them, Paul McCartney, Ringo Starr, and George, returned to the studio to finish John Lennon's unfinished demos, old tensions resurfaced. Despite the public's excitement over the reunion, George still found working with Paul challenging. He bristled under Paul's direction and made no effort to hide his frustration. Producer Jeff Lynne later recalled how George would roll his eyes whenever Paul got too controlling. The old dynamic, it seemed, was still alive and well. Paul later admitted that their relationship was still difficult, even after all these years. The wounds of the past had not healed, and the tension between them remained. Harrison's final years and reflections. In 1997, George Harrison was diagnosed with throat cancer, which he fought for several years before the disease spread to his lungs and brain. During his final years, he lived a largely private life with his wife, Olivia, and their son, Donnie, at their home in Friar Park. Despite his declining health, George's sense of humor and philosophical outlook remained intact. When asked in a 2001 online chat whether Paul still annoyed him, George didn't give a direct answer. Instead, he quoted an old Victorian proverb, "Scan not a friend with a microscopic glass. You know his faults, then let his foibles pass." His response was a perfect reflection of his personality, elegant, philosophical, and pointed. As he faced his final days, George remained in touch with old friends, including Paul, with whom he shared a quiet personal meeting. Paul later described it as a moment of reconciliation, though the emotional distance between them had never fully closed. Harrison's legacy and final words. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at a friend's home in Los Angeles, surrounded by loved ones. His final words, according to Olivia, were simple: love one another. Yet, even in death, the complexities of his relationships remained. While Paul McCartney spoke warmly of George after his passing, the unspoken tension between them had never fully dissolved. In interviews, Paul expressed grief, but George's quiet pain lingered in their fractured bond. George's legacy, however, extends beyond his time with the Beatles. He left behind a body of work that spanned music, spirituality, and quiet rebellion. Though he was never the loudest Beatle, his silence spoke volumes. Through his music and his life, George Harrison's story is one of resilience, creative frustration, and the quiet struggle to find his own voice amidst the noise.